Hello, everyone, and welcome back. We are now talking about qualitative research participants and data collection. And in our textbook, we're reading chapter 10. And so the material in this presentation is largely drawn from our textbook, but also some from other sources. Okay, so let's get started. Slide 2. So how do you identify the participants and the data collection in a qualitative study? Usually this information is found in the methods section if it's not mentioned earlier than that. You're looking for information about the sites or settings or context and the participants. And you can also identify the types of qualitative data that were gathered and the procedures that were used. So were there interviews? Were there focus group interviews? Was it observation? That kind of thing. And usually the researchers will mention any issues related to collecting that data. So slide 3. So how do we select sites and participants in a qualitative study? Now, when we learned about quantitative studies, we talked about random selection when possible, right? With qualitative studies, the selection is very different. We're going to purposefully select particular sites or particular participants within a site. And this is purposeful sampling or purposive sampling. And we're trying to select the participants who are going to be most appropriate for us learning about our central phenomenon, for us answering our research question. And so some of the specific strategies, there are a lot of different strategies, and some of you noticed that table with all of the different strategies in sampling strategies listed. Maximal variation is one way of going about it. Maybe you want many diverse perspectives. So you're going to try to get people with a bunch of different backgrounds or perspectives. Now, homogeneous sampling is what you're going to use when you're trying to identify a subgroup, okay, and really explore their perspectives in depth. And then snowball sampling is used most often when the people you want may be hard to find. Okay, it's not necessarily obvious who they are. So let's say you know two people who are experts in teaching kids of color with disabilities, right? And so you might ask those two people, well, who do you think are other experts in teaching kids of color with disabilities, right? And then you kind of like the snowball grows as, some people refer you to other people who refer you to other people who refer you to other people, and so on. That's what snowball sampling is. Okay, how many for a qualitative study? It all depends. It can range from 2 to 3 individuals or to 30 or 40. It all depends on the approach that you're taking in your research design, right? So we talked about narratives and this life story kind of thing. That's going to be 1 or 2 individuals, right? Phenomenology really depends on what you're looking at. Maybe 5 to 15 people. Case studies are typically 1 case, particularly at the graduate school level, and then postgraduate school researchers often collaborate in order to do cross case studies. Ethnographies, you're focusing on one group, one cultural or social group. And for grounded theory, you're going to keep interviewing people or whatever your data collection method is until saturation is reached. And saturation is when you start hearing the same story again, or the same why or how again. And you feel like, okay, you understand this because people are starting to repeat other people that you interviewed earlier. So what kind of data do qualitative researchers collect? Interviews, right, is something that's, I think, probably most prevalent. Observations, and we talked about that participant observer, like the volunteer in the classroom. Documents, and particularly with life history analysis, these might be things like diaries or journals. Audio-visual materials can be videos or pictures or artwork, that kind of thing. Slide 6. Now, for any of these forms, we're not going to, load it onto the computer and hit enter and have SPSS do something to it, right? We may use a qualitative tool, computer tool, like NVivo or Atlas or one of those tools that'll assist us, but essentially the researcher is the tool. We are the ones who are collecting the data and interpreting it. Okay, whether we're a participant observer, whether we're writing field notes with descriptive or reflective information, whatever it is doing, the researcher is the tool. So let's talk about interviewing in more depth, because interviewing is probably the data collection method that we most associate with qualitative research, and it's also the one that's most used, okay? And it's so versatile. Okay, so interviewing. There are two books that when I was taking one of my qualitative research methods classes that I was introduced to. One was Interviews, and this is very kind of a famous book by Qual, and this is an introduction to qualitative research interviewing. And it's like goes into a lot of depth, and there's a lot of theory in there as well. And one that's a little bit more kind of like a practical guide is Sedman's Interviewing as Qualitative Research. And I've included a reference list at the end of this presentation, this revised presentation, so that you'd have access to that information if you wanted it. And so Qual talks about there being 7 stages of an interview investigation. Okay, so we're doing a qualitative interview, right? It's possible to do a quantitative interview, but we're talking about qualitative interviews here. First is thematizing. What theme are you, what topic are you interested in? What's the purpose of your investigation? Next, you design your study. Okay, which is very similar to what we've talked about for designing qualitative studies overall. Then you conduct your interviews. All right, and then after you've conducted your interviews, there's a way that you need to process it, because we're going to turn these spoken words into text, into written text. Transcribing is usually how interview data, audio recordings, are turned from spoken words, oral speech, into written text. Analyzing it based on your purpose, your topic, the nature of the material, all of these things are going to determine how you're going to go about analyzing it. Verifying it. There are ways that you want to go about checking, first of all, what you wrote down, and second of all, your interpretations of what you heard. And then reporting. How are you going to communicate your findings? How are you going to express what you learned through your interview or interviews? So procedures for qualitative interviews. I'm on slide 8. The researcher asks one or more participants open-ended questions and records their answers. So usually we're not doing yes or no questions. We're not asking rating type questions. We're asking questions that are open-ended, because we really want our participants to talk. We want to note their lived experience, right? So we want them to talk. So a question that allows an open-ended question is a question that allows the participant to, have options for responding, right? So when we think of quantitative surveys, we think of very limited choices on how you're going to respond. Well, qualitative interviews are opposite to that. You want to pay attention when you're reading studies. You want to pay attention to why why the person used interviews, what type of interviews they conducted, what questions were asked, and often the specific questions are included in the actual article, I think usually at the end, and how the interviewer recorded the conversation. Ooh, I forgot to turn off my phone. There we go. Okay. Yes, how the interviewer recorded the conversation. Did they just take notes, or did they actually, audio record it and then have it transcribed? Now, usually, as you doing interviews, before you sit down to do an interview, what you do is you write out a protocol, and this is basically a script of questions that you're going to ask. Now, some interviews are more structured than others. Here's a list of exactly the questions this is exactly what I'm going to say. Less structured is when you go in kind of very open, hey, I'm here to learn more about how to be an effective teacher of students of color with disabilities. Can you tell me about that? Okay, I'm very open. But there are some guidelines that really help you get good data. Listening more and talking less, which is hard for those of us who are educators, I think, or healers or that kind of thing. Not interrupting, being comfortable with silence, avoiding leading questions, so we want to hear the participants' perspective, not just have them regurgitate what we believe. We want to keep the participants focused on our topic without, being rude about it. We want to follow up on comments or questions that we have, so that we kind of are making sure we're interpreting things correctly, not being judgmental or biased. And it is not about debating the participant at all. No, we want to learn their perspective, understand their lived experience. Okay. So there are some questions that are common. We ask about behaviors. This is slide 10. We ask about opinions, values, perceptions, feelings, their knowledge, what they sensed, what did you see, what did you feel, what did you hear, what did you smell? And we might start out with some background or some demographics if those are easy questions for the participant to answer. So taking a closer look, I put a link to an article specifically for beginning researchers in the reference list, and that's Jacob and Ferguson 2012. Now, there's a difference between research questions and interview questions, okay? And so here are some suggestions for ways to phrase good open questions, which as you hear them, you'll see they're very different from the kinds of questions that we think of as research questions. Tell me more about a time when there was a student of color with disabilities who you felt like learned a whole lot. Describe the people who are most important to, particular students or a particular group that you're interested in. Describe the first time you ever taught a student with disabilities, let's say. Tell me about the person who taught you about how to best work with students of color with disabilities. And what stands out for you when you remember working with a particularly tricky student? Tell me a story. I noticed that, this teacher, your lesson guide here, it has all kinds of decorations and things on it. Can you tell me a little bit more about that? And can you describe a typical day? What's your typical day like? And if you were describing yourself to yourself, or maybe if someone was introducing you, what do you think they would say about you? How would you describe yourself? Open-ended questions. We really want to elicit people's perspectives. Okay. Slide 12. When you're sequencing the questions, when you're thinking about the order, you you want to get the participant involved immediately. And so you want to ask like easy questions first. So you might ask background and demographic questions if those are easy and they're not going to put the person on edge. Like if somebody would have say to me, so what are you? And they're trying to get at my ethnic background. That might put me a little bit on edge. I've gotten that question before. Um, Ask about the facts first. That's another strategy. You're just asking about the facts, right? And then later you can ask about more of the controversy that may have happened in a particular setting or with particular participants. And you might spread the fact-based questions throughout the interview because that gives you kind of like a point of reference. Oh yeah, when did that happen? Oh, okay. And I see. And who was there? That might give you kind of like a reference point and kind of frame things for you and maybe even give the participant a little break from some of the kind of more in-depth questions you might be asking. Ask about the present first now. And then you can work backwards into the past or forwards into the future, into hopes and dreams. And finally, always ask if there's anything else that the participant wants to add. Sometimes that's where you get your juiciest tidbits. Is like, is there anything I haven't asked you about that you'd like to tell me about? And yeah, because sometimes that can be really generative. Okay, slide 13. In terms of preparing, you want a place with few distractions and you want to make sure you put your phone on vibrate. You want to prepare your voice recorder and please test it. Please test it and have extra batteries because it's really heartbreaking when you have a really good interview and then you realize you've lost half of it because of a technology problem. Then you follow your protocol and you go through. And then the protocol, and it just includes all the basic information about how you're going to conduct the interview, and that's on there. There are some bullets there on slide 14 about what's in there. And now, one of the things that really helps to have a good interview is to be qualified to conduct that interview. I'm sure some of you have seen talk shows where it was like the person hadn't read their guest's book or seen their guest's movie, and it was kind of like random and they weren't asking really good questions. And other cases where it was clear that the interview had done their homework, and so you get better questions and more insightful answers. So being knowledgeable, being familiar with your topic, having a structure, being clear, being gentle. Okay, it can be very vulnerable to be interviewed. So being gentle, thinking critically, but not speaking in a critical and judgmental way, and remembering things that the participant has told you, so so they don't feel like you're not listening. And then finally, you can kind of interpret or speak back to the participant at certain points and say, it sounds like what you're saying is X, just so you make sure that you're understanding. Now, there are a lot of different ways of doing an interview. You could do a focus group, okay, which is when you're interviewing a group of people, essentially. You could interview someone online, right? So maybe it's emails back and forth, or it's text back and forth, or it's a discussion board, some kind of social media group. Now, interview questions can also come in paper form or be like a survey. And the way you know a qualitative survey is that it'll be open-ended questions with lots of space for the participant to write about their lived experience. How do researchers record data during their interview? They might take field notes, right? And what I learned the hard way, kind of, is that you don't want to be like so concentrating on taking your notes that you're A, missing what your person is saying, and B, distracting them while they're trying to think about what they're going to say next. So yeah, I might be jotting down notes down here. Yeah, oh yes, just of things that I want to remember, or I really stand out, or I want to refer back to later in their interview. But the main thing is you're usually going to be getting an audio record, whether it's with a analog tape recorder with the little cassette, which I don't think a whole lot of people use anymore, or with a digital recorder, or with your phone or something, but as long as it's reliable, you want a reliable tool to record with. Okay, some important things to note, particularly as you're reading about other people's interviews. No, I'm sorry. Slide 18. Let's switch gears. Let's talk about observation, okay? Procedures for doing qualitative observations, right? And usually these are participant observations. Why did the researcher gather observations? Why did they decide to go about it that way? What was the researcher's role? Were they non-participants and they were basically just watching? Were they participants in the setting? Did their role change? How did they record their data? Did they do descriptive and reflective field notes? How did they go about that? And how many times were they there in the setting observing? Was it yeah, and we'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about trustworthiness. And then finally, were there specific types of documents that were also collected in addition to the observation? Now, there are other ways of collecting qualitative data in addition to interviews and observations, which are the two primary ways. You can examine records or archival documents, journals, maps, video and audio tape, artifacts, like any kind of physical materials that are there that can help you learn about the answers to your research questions. Things to note regarding the collection of these materials. You want to understand your central phenomena. So it may be that there are photographs, videos, paintings, objects that will help you do that. Now, one of the things to think about is, were these things created for this research project, or were they created for some other purpose? And so the purpose that they were created for might influence how we're going to interpret them, right? And so, for example, I might look at the marketing materials that a school puts out, right? And I'm going to interpret what's in those marketing materials, knowing that they were designed to sell viewers on how great the school was, right? Okay, and how do these forms provide insight into whatever your central phenomena is that you're studying? Now, photographs can be used in a couple of different ways. You can show participants pictures and have them then talk about their pictures. They can also draw pictures, and you can have them talk about it. And basically, the picture is being used to elicit spoken information, to elicit information. It's to like jog their memory, kind of. It gives you a starting point for a conversation. Now, another thing you can do is this procedure called photo voice, where the participants actually take and discuss their photographs. And this is seen as a way of empowering the participants, because they're in a way creating the data that they're bringing to you. They're in a way co-researching with you. Okay, so that's about data collection. In slide 22, let's talk about ethical issues. Now, in a lot of ways, the ethical issues with qualitative research are the same as the ethical issues with quantitative research. You're still going to be working with an institutional review board. You are still, going to be following the ethical codes of conduct for your professional organization. You need to be especially careful, though, with procedures that respect participants' rights. With qualitative research, you're actually talking directly to people. And there's a certain amount of power that researchers have. So we need to be careful to respect participants' rights, and we need to take steps to respect their anonymity. Now, there are challenges to gaining access and gathering data, okay? There may be a gatekeeper, for example. I'm on slide 23. There may be a person who you have to go through before you can talk to the participants you're interested in. If I want to talk to the teachers and the kids at a particular school, I need to get permission from the principal and possibly from someone at the district level. If I want to talk to those athletes, I need to get permission from the head coach, and possibly if they're young, also have parental consent to talk with them. You know, they're often they're gatekeepers because again, you're interacting face to face with people, and those of us who are educators, those people might be children or youth, and so you know, there are procedures and things that we may need to do in order to gain access to our participants or to a site. Now, as you're looking at papers, you're going to be looking for some of the things that we've talked about. So on slide 24, it talks about how you evaluate participants and data collection in a qualitative study. Sampling strategy. You're going to be looking for some of the indicators of higher quality sampling, and that the sampling procedures are fully described and justified. Also, is the sample size appropriate and justified? Is it sufficiently small to go in depth? And is it sufficiently, you know, are there enough people where you feel like the question is going to be answered adequately? Okay, is it consistent with what the goals of the research are? Now, in quantitative research, we talked about validity and reliability. With qualitative research, we're talking about trustworthiness, okay, is the kind of comparable idea. How trustworthy is this study? How trustworthy is this research project? And trustworthiness was described by Lincoln and Guba in 1985 in a very influential book on qualitative research called Naturalistic Inquiry. And Lincoln and Guba identified kind of like 4 things that paralleled aspects of validity and reliability that were on the quantitative side. So they were translating into the kind of qualitative framework what validity and reliability are. So this idea of trustworthiness, credibility. Were you there long enough for us to believe that what you think you saw, or us to believe that what you think you heard from participants is what really reflects their lived experience? Transferability. Do the things that you're describing, do I feel like in my setting there's a way that they transfer? Can I identify with your participants and the setting in such a way that I feel like the things that you found might transfer into my setting and with my clients or my students? Dependability. Do I think that if I were to do, this is about procedure, if I were to do the same things that you did in a similar setting with similar participants, would I also elicit any, you know, information similar to what you did? Were your procedures dependable, or did it seem haphazard? You know, you just happened to show up and see this one thing, and therefore that's what you're basing your whole study on, right? Okay, and confirmability. So, is there some way that you're confirming your findings either internally or externally? Like, do your findings relate to other things that are out there in the literature? In some way. Of course, they're not going to be identical because qualitative studies are by nature particularistic, particular individuals in particular settings. But is there, you know, things that, oh yeah, this person said something similar and that person said something similar. Oh, and within your setting, these 3 people said something similar and your documents back that up as well. Okay, so this idea of trustworthiness. And then on slide 26 and 27, there's more about evaluating participants and data collection in qualitative studies. So, and 28 also. So just, the same kind of table that we've been looking at in terms of what you're looking for when you're looking at studies. And next week, I'll be showing you some links to some studies that I think where you can start to do some of this work in terms of evaluating and seeing if you see some of these things that we've talked about. Okay, and on slide 29, those are those references I talked with you about, including that link to an article on how students who are new to qualitative research can write interview protocols and conduct interviews. Okay, I hope that was helpful, and I hope that you have a great day. Okay, see you next time. Bye-bye.